Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're just waiting for folks to come on in through the portal here. We'll wait another minute or so and then we'll get started. All right, we'll get started. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Elaine Stiles. I'm the faculty director of the RWU, Public Humanities and Arts Collaborative, and welcome to this evening's installment of our Hidden Truths, Stories of Race and Place lecture series. This is our third year of the Hidden Truths series, which showcases the research and policy work of RWU faculty and staff who are resurfacing untold histories and complicating received knowledge and understandings of our collective pasts. I'd like to thank the Provost's Office for their continued support of our series, our faculty and staff whose work we're privileged to feature, and you, our audience, for your engagement on these important issues. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I have a few housekeeping notes. First, there will be a Q&A session after the lecture. So if you have a question or comment you'd like to share about this evening's talk, you can use the Q&A feature at any time to record that. Second, if you enjoy tonight's discussion and would like to view other lectures in the Hidden Truths series, they are available on the Hidden Truths YouTube channel, and I'll put the link to that in the chat in a few minutes in case you would like to bookmark that. So without further ado, tonight we're pleased to welcome Brenda Clement, who's the Director of HousingWorks Rhode Island at Roger Williams University, who will present her talk entitled Zip Code Matters, How Where You Live Impacts Economic, Health, and Educational Outcomes. HousingWorks serves as a clearinghouse of information about housing in Rhode Island. It releases a yearly fact book and other research to promote dialogue among policymakers about the importance of safe and affordable housing for our state's economic future and for residents' well-being. Brenda is a longtime advocate for affordable housing in New England with over 20 years of experience in the housing and community development field. HousingWorks at, she's, sorry, I lost my spot there for a second. Sorry, Brenda. At HousingWorks Rhode Island, Brenda oversees conversations about, visions of Rhode Island in which communities embrace a variety of housing choices so that residents, regardless of income, can live in healthy, quality homes in vibrant and thriving neighborhoods. Before joining HousingWorks Rhode Island, Brenda served as Executive Director of Citizens Housing and the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, Executive Director of the Housing Action Coalition of Rhode Island, and as Executive Director of the Housing Network, the Rhode Island Trade Association for Community Development Corporations. Brenda also serves on the board of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and has received many awards and recognition for her work, including a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2012 from Rhode Island Housing. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, Brenda, and I will turn things over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today on a favorite subject here. And of course, my screen isn't advancing for some reason, but let me try it again. Yep. My computer, of course, doesn't want to cooperate. So, whoop, there we go. Let me go back. So thank you again for the opportunity to be with you today. My apologies while I'm sharing the screen. I can't see everyone, but I'm sure that at least a few people on this call are folks that could easily give this lecture as well too. And so I look forward to feedback and comments from you when we get to Q&A time. But let me just give you a little bit more background about HousingWorks. Elaine already talked a little bit about it, but we were founded in 2004 as part of one of the first housing bond campaigns that happened in Rhode Island to fund the development of affordable housing. We were integrated into Roger Williams University at the Providence campus in 2014. And as Elaine noted, we try to show through our research and policy and convenings that trying to connect the dots between housing affordability and economic development and growth and outcomes and improving outcomes in health and education. So if you're not familiar with some of our reports and documents, I'd encourage you to go to our website to see the number of tools, and our team. At the end of this, the last slide, I'll show you our team members who do a lot of the great work and are always a great resource as well too. So tonight I'd like to talk a little bit about and give a very brief history of housing policy and racial discrimination nationally. Then take a quick look at Rhode Island's experience with one of those discriminatory policies called redlining. And again, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir on a lot of these terms as well too, but we'll talk a little bit more about all of what that means. And then talk in general about housing affordability, and then spend most of our time hopefully talking about why equity matters and why where we live and what zip code we grow up in or spend most of our time has a big impact on our health outcomes, our educational outcomes, and economic achievement. And then how do we move forward? How do we work with municipalities and other partners to address many of the disparities that we know exist? So it's a lot to cover in a very short period of time. So we'll dive right in and I'll do my best. So as we probably no surprise again to anyone here, land home ownership has always been restricted in the U.S. Even before we were an independent nation. Early European colonists claimed land from Native tribes and forced Native populations to live in designated districts separate from colonial settlements. That continued early on in this 1700s. The British government provided some protection to native lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, but following the American Revolution, that deal was invalidated, and the U.S. government seized land from native tribes. And we all have had many discussions in our communities about these challenging problems that we've all faced because of that. And again, that was continued well into the first half of the 19th century and westward expansion, appropriating even more native lands. Discrimination by race as well as religion and country of origin were rampant and were permitted by policies that either actively encouraged it or did little to prevent it. In some states, for instance, free Black men were forbidden from purchasing land, and courts routinely invalidated gifts or other transfers of property to Black people. Even outside of slaveholding jurisdictions, opportunities for land home ownership were often limited, either by direct law or of the failure to regulate any kind of discriminatory practices. Policies in the post-Civil War period continued to limit particularly BIPOC property ownership and prohibit Black land acquisitions were prohibitive in many states, even following the emancipation of former slaveholding states. Laws that we know were like exploitive practices like sharecropping entrenched many of the racial inequities that we are still dealing with today. For example, Asian laborers brought to the U.S. in the late 19th century were often forced to live in ethnic enclaves and could not acquire property outside these designated districts, some of which have evolved into our now iconic Chinatown neighborhoods. Unfortunately, the patterns continued well into the turn of the century, of the 20th century, and a new wave of housing and land use policies were introduced across the U.S. In an attempt to disperse households from crowded cities and encourage more property ownership. We saw the beginning of suburbanization through both federal housing policies and also through transportation policies. Underlying many of these laws, however, was a concerted effort to segregate households by race and ethnicity. Many of these policies, both state and local and federal, were explicit in their exclusion of BIPOC from living in and owning property in certain neighborhoods. other segregated neighborhoods economically by permitting only single-family homes to be built in the most desirable neighborhoods, effectively pricing out many households of color from these areas. And then in general, a lack of enforcement against private acts of overt discrimination also encouraged that. And then worse yet, the change during the Great Depression, when new federal programs were developed to help stimulate the economy through home building and buying, also through the Federal Housing Administration Agency, also created worsened this disparities in treatment as well too. The FHA only covered loans on newly constructed housing in stable neighborhoods as defined by color-coded maps, the redlining that many of us have heard. These were developed by local real estate boards based on existing distributions of population and housing types, and were in general racially segregated by local policy and private actions as well. And many of you have probably seen and heard of Richard Rothstein's book, A Color of Law, that talks a lot about these policies by the federal government that helped, and not helped, but did segregate metropolitan areas. But the other, in addition to redlining, though, the other important program that contributed to this was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. A lot of that displacement happened under the terms of urban renewal and various city designs, where publicly built and subsidized rental housing provided an inexpensive housing option for low-income individuals, but were limited to certain parts of neighborhoods and communities as well too. These same federal policies often cause great displacement of communities of color, particularly to make room for new highways or commercial centers and other urban renewal efforts. The development of Lincoln Center, for instance, in New York City, it forced the relocation of over 7,000 families and 800 businesses in a neighborhood that up until that point had been largely Black, Puerto Rican, and Asian immigrant populations. So this, and then even post 1968, where we saw the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, making race-based housing discrimination illegal, the enforcement of fair housing and the tools for enforcement in fair housing and other federal laws that were passed around that same time, including the Community Reinvestment Act and the Home Mortgage Disclosure Data, continued not to be good tool or not to be strong enough tools to address and deal with some of the ongoing disparity that we see in these neighborhoods and its communities. So the result has been, as we often know, and why we talk about, we'll talk more about this, is that this history of housing segregation in America has a fact, and how it factors in many, many ways, particularly in neighborhoods of color or lower income, and by causing great disparities in health, usually poor, wealth, usually much less, education, considerably underfunded, and policing, which in general is much more aggressive for Black communities in US cities. And if my computer will cooperate, I'm going to try to show this video. So it's very brief for a second. And Elaine, please let me know if I'm doing this wrong.
Brenda, we're seeing a screen, but no video yet.
Sorry, is it showing?
I could hear the video, but I can't see it yet. I can't see it anyway.
Can you tell us the name of the woman that would not leave her seat on the bus? Ooh, that's hard. Are you sure it was a woman? Oh, I got it. You know what's so sad, man? You know, it's why Martin Luther King stood for nonviolence. Now what's Martin Luther King? A street. And I don't give a fuck where you live in America. If you're a Martin Luther King, there's some violence going down. The thing. You can't call nobody telling me you lost on MLK. I'm lost. I'm on Martin Luther King. Run! Sad, sad, sad.
Sorry about that. Hopefully it was showing. I'm not sure if it was, but can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Brenda.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm not sure if that showed, but that's for some of you who couldn't see it. Were you able to see it at all, Elaine, or was it not showing?
You know, we could hear some of it, but we weren't, I wasn't able to see the video. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, it's a clip and you can just go to YouTube and see it yourself, but we'll send you this PowerPoint afterwards. But it's a very brief clip from comedian Chris Rock that talks about Martin Luther King Boulevard and how, you know, despite the fact that we create these neighborhoods and communities under the laudable goals of Martin Luther King, that most of these neighborhoods and communities are generally very unsafe neighborhoods and communities. So it's worth taking a quick look at it. It's sad but true, unfortunately. So, and while redlining and that and the federal policy that we talked about on the federal level was alive and well in Rhode Island too. This is I'm going to try to go to it. Hopefully, it will share a screen as well too with our colleagues at HWRI that have put together a great blog around redlining in Rhode Island. And so I'd encourage you to take a look at it. But you can see some of the maps from a project called Mapping Inequality, where there were a number of redline neighborhoods by the federal government in several Providence neighborhoods: Fox Point, South Providence, West Elmwood, Lippet Hill. Providence was not the only city. My community in Pawtucket was redlined on a 1935 map, starting near the Division Street Bridge, following the river down Pleasant Street, right about where near the new soccer stadium is going. In nearby Central Falls, a neighborhood off Lonsdale Avenue was redlined, and Woonsocket had 3 neighborhoods in communities. So as you can see, this was alive and well, and it's policies like redlining in our communities today. So let me move on from there. Oops, sorry. So I want to talk a little bit about affordability and what it means to be affordable housing, and then get in a little bit more as to why why it matters to have good housing options in every community to address some of these disparities, but also to help people achieve economically as well. And what do we mean by affordability? And as many of you probably know, the federal government defines affordability as if you're paying no more than 30% of your income on housing. And that is based on your gross income. And if you pay more than that, you're considered to be housing cost burden. And as you can see, this is an estimate of what a healthy housing budget would look like. And at the higher income level, if you end up having to pay more for your housing, if your housing ends up being 40% or even 50% of your expense, you start to make sacrifices in other categories, right? Say maybe you save less, or you don't spend as much on entertainment, you don't buy a new car. But as you go further on down the income spectrum and towards lower income, those choices become much more dire. Lower income workers have to choose between food and housing, or rent and paying the utility bill, or rent and buying medication. And as we can see, for a household income of $63,000 in Rhode Island, what you can afford is much higher than what is currently available on the market. There's two ways to get to affordability: market price affordable or long-term affordability. And Rhode Island has this law in the books called the State Low to Moderate Income Housing Act that defines the long-term affordability of housing and the requirements. And this is what many of you have probably heard of, the 10% goal that all communities in Rhode Island have to achieve towards affordability in their housing stock. Right now, only 6 out of the 39 communities have achieved that goal, with one community, East Providence, hopefully joining those ranks very soon as well too. Our colleague at Roger Williams, June Speakman, is a state representative and is chairing the commission that has been looking very closely at that law and other housing legislation to, again, try to address the ongoing need. And as you can see, there's a lot of need in Rhode Island. 1 out of 3 Rhode Islanders are considered cost burden or not able to or spending too much on their housing costs, whether it's rental or home ownership. And for many individuals, including people at the median household income, there is not one single community in Rhode Island of their 39 cities and towns where you could affordably buy anywhere. And even if you're the median renter income in the state of about $34,000, there's only one community where you can actually affordably rent. And if anyone knows the answer to that, put it in the chat and we'll talk which community that is, and we'll talk about that in Q&A. And this is just another way of looking at cost burden households. And so the reason why this matters is because when it's 1 out of 3 Rhode Islanders, and knowing how well connected we all are to each other in this community, it means that somebody in your network, if not your own family, and if not you, are cost burden or is spending too much on household income, on expenses. And then COVID hit, as we know, and the COVID showed very quickly why stable housing was critical for economic growth and development, but also to deal with the public health crisis. And we saw disproportionate impacts on many of these neighborhoods and communities that have been disinvested in for a number of years, and housing is inadequate in those communities. And widespread COVID numbers and unemployment statistics were centered in many of these communities in Central Falls and Pawtucket and neighborhoods in Providence. And so again, I think COVID reminded us of the real strong need for us to address these disparities. Again, many of you know this already and know what this is and what is equity as opposed to equality. Again, equity is to try to level the playing field and realizing that we all are different and that we all have had different opportunities in our lives as well too. And so the assistance that some of us may need to reach the fruit on the tree is also different. And so trying to create those equitable solutions for neighborhoods and communities so that regardless of which zip code you grow up in or live in, you have equal access to the fruit on the tree. So zip codes and life outcomes, HousingWorks in partnership with the Rhode Island Department of Health has done a great deal of work on increasing awareness around social determinants of health and why they matter. And social determinants impact all aspects of our life, from both education, neighborhood and community, economic stability. And so the Chris Rock joke that, if you live in Martin Luther King street, the economic stability in the neighborhood environment may not be the best, and most communities and violence may be much stronger. And there is huge disparity among region and around cities and towns and around zip codes around social determinants. Again, in the chat, if somebody wants to put an answer, and we'll talk about it later, but anyone know what the one of the main reasons for absenteeism is in Providence school system? I'll let you put an answer in and we'll talk more about that in chat, but it's a huge factor in neighborhood and environment, social determinant. And we see, as again, as I said, from the COVID impact, great disparity by zip code and by region and community as well too. And this, we feel, is strongly tied to housing and housing affordability. So again, a lot of inequities exist in the Rhode Island housing market, both in the renter and homeownership market. And you can see some of the disparities that exist. Homeownership rate for whites is about twice that of Black and Latino, more than twice that for Latino homeownership in the state. And that number has not significantly budged since the late 1960s. Let me say that again, because to let it sink in, we've not seen substantial progress or any real change in that number since the late 1960s, which means that we have cut out now several generations of families of race and BIPOC families from what for most of us is one of the most important wealth creation tool, and that is homeownership. And so the disparities, when we break these numbers down by community, also are significant. And we see many, many areas and urban core communities with much lower homeownership rates than, excuse me, than other parts of the state, and even neighborhoods in Providence from the east side to the west side vary greatly. Again, there's lots of groups out there. We're working on this well before COVID, but now working even more on this to address and show these gaps in equity that exist on a number of different fronts. And if you're not familiar with Enterprise and Opportunity 360 and the Public and Affordable Housing Research Corporation, I'd encourage you to take a look and plug in regions and zip codes and see the examples that exist in your own community. So how do we move forward in a more equitable way, and how do we address some of these, as I said, long-term disparities that have existed because of policies that our government, both federal and state and local, have put into place? None of them are in theory in place anymore, right? But we know, in fact, that much of the impact of the policies still exist as well too, and we still see regular violations of fair housing laws and other tools that we know have to continue to be addressed. So there are a number of very interesting equity initiatives across Rhode Island. The big one being the health equity zones that exist in a number of communities. Actually, I think there are even more in these communities now, more HESs that have been added in communities as well too. The Working Cities Challenge that the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston had been working on and encouraging as well too, has done a lot of great work to try to address some of the inequity issues that we have seen across community as well too. HousingWorks is pleased to be doing a series of trainings with the health equity zones funded by the United Way to look at how housing happens locally and helping local residents understand the local planning board process, zoning board process, and different factors at the local level so that they can become good advocates for housing and housing development in their community as well too. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that front and on land use and zoning issues as well. And as I said, there's a lot that cities and towns play. Most of the funding for building and developing affordable housing comes at us from the federal, and now a little bit in Rhode Island at the state level as well too. But where it gets built and what it looks like are largely controlled at the local level or at the municipal level. So planning and zoning and supporting a variety of housing choices is critical. Code enforcement, public works, where we invest our infrastructure dollars is also critical. Rhode Island really has two housing problems as it relates to particularly affordable housing. We simply just do not have enough of it and have been underproducing housing for a long period of time. The peak building period in Rhode Island was in the mid 1980s when we were building about had about 7,500 building permits per year. Since the last almost 20 years now, building permits have been a little bit over 1,000 building permits per year, which have simply just not kept up with the demand for housing, and which is what's causing our current housing shortage and housing crisis. We also know that we also have a quality problem. We have some of the oldest housing stock in the country, and much of our housing, particularly multifamily housing, was built very early on and is tied for third with Massachusetts as some of the oldest in the country. And much of that stock has suffered from absentee ownership, deferred maintenance, and just general age and so needs significant reinvestment in order to extend its life and for people to live in them in safe and quality homes. So again, lots of tools that a municipality can work on, though, to address housing issues, but they're not always doing that, and many communities do not currently have an active plan, and we still see lots of local resistance to housing development. I'm sure many of you have heard the terms NIMBYism, not in my backyard, bananas, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody or anything, and cave people, citizens against virtually everything. And so housing, and particularly affordable housing development, has significant obstacles at the local level, and many misinformation about what it needs, who needs it, and what it looks like still exists to this day. But there are a lot of things that communities can do. And again, working with lots of other partners, we're trying to help communities understand that growth and managing growth in their communities, addressing housing needs in their communities, is good for their communities, and something that will help to not only address individual needs, but also address some long-standing disparity issues that exist across the state. So again, part of what we're trying to do to add to this space and add to this discussion, as I said, the pandemic and COVID-19 highlighted how geography shapes opportunities for well-being, and given the distinct character of Rhode Island cities and towns and how that has been codified over time, the goals and strategies of the state and municipalities are sometimes out of sync, and that has prevented the development as we move forward as well, too. And again, trying to make our land use more equitable as we move forward. So we have begun to participate in a project created by Desegregate Connecticut to create a national zoning atlas, and our work on mapping and participation in that project has been inspired by Desegregate Connecticut and Mass Housing Partnership, and using a number of tools developed here. And my colleagues Annette Bourne and Bryce Kelly have been leading our work in this space, and we're trying to show how using all of these tools, trying to show where it makes sense to grow as communities, and where and this is just some example of Rhode Island work, and what currently we have as zoning and land use, and what we can often we can promote to change. And again, we know that Rhode Island has a lot of work to do in this space. Zoning and land use is preventing a lot of development. Zoning has an important place to play in local development and local community development. Unfortunately, for the most 20, 30 plus years, zoning has been used more as an exclusionary tool, and large lot zoning and only single family zoning has prevented sensible growth and development in our community, or smart growth development in our community. Again, in the chat, if people want to put their guesstimate as to how much of Rhode Island, excluding protected lands, is zoned single family, we'll talk more about that in Q&A. And this we're happy to be part of the Zoning Atlas project, and we'll be doing some releases soon. So despite the need and despite the demand for housing, Rhode Island still lags behind other New England states in our investment in affordable homes. This is a somewhat dated chart, but I'm sad to say it's not improved much over the last couple of years. You probably have heard a lot about the $250 million that the General Assembly and the governor included in the state budget last year for housing and housing production programs. All of that money, however, was federal money, and Rhode Island continues still to rely overly heavily on federal resources, with about almost 75% of the funding and money that we currently have for housing programs and housing investment are federal dollars, and only about 25-30% are state funded funds and dollars as well. So this is a comparison of what other states do with their state dollars into housing. And as you can see, both Mass and Connecticut are far and ahead of us as well. So this is, again, just other ways that communities can think about being creative. And there's a lot of attention and interest on these issues moving forward. But we think that housing and providing more housing opportunities and providing more areas of opportunity are critical for us to make sure that regardless of which zip code you live in, you have access to good schools, good safe housing, access to good jobs, and live in safe environments. These are a lot of great resources. And again, I think we're sharing some of these slide deck or slideshow that you can dive in deeper later on your own as well too. And then, as I promised, here's our great HousingWorks team and our contact information, and we're happy to be a community partner here in Rhode Island. So I think I didn't talk too long, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, so hopefully I can see some of you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Audience members, I invite you to put any questions or comments you have in the Q&A, and we'll start the Q&A portion of our evening together. While we're waiting for that to happen, I think you did have some answers in the chat. Somebody guessed Burrillville.
They guessed Burrillville, and they guessed correctly. That is the only community in Rhode Island that you can afford to rent in without being cost burden at this time. So good job. And also just a shout out to Professor Monica Teixeira de Souza, who is part of the law school's housing challenge, did a great presentation a couple of weeks ago and speaks regularly on these topics. And as I said, like I suspect many people on this call could easily have given this lecture as well too. So glad to have you with us as well. And there's a couple of questions in chat. I'm just looking at those now too. Hold on, I can't see chat for some reason. Oh no, maybe I can now. Thanks, Elaine, for putting the video link in.
Oh, sure. Yeah. The chat. The folks will have to ask the
Okay,
Q&A.
I can't see it.
But I think we did have a question come in, and I'll read them since since not visible to our attendees. Oh, here's a few coming in. This is from Katie Gradowski. It says, that was really wonderful. Thank you. I was wondering if you could go back and talk more about the mapping HousingWorks is doing. What is being captured in the maps, and how are you hoping to use them? I assume this is about the National Zoning Atlas.
Yep.
Okay.
So Katie, thanks for that question. We are planning a soft release of the zoning maps in end of early April, and then we'll be doing a full release after that. So happy to share more details with you after that as well too. But we also will be we're trying to make them as inclusive as possible, and mapping and not only existing zoning uses and what things are currently zoned for in communities, but also overlaying flood zones and current actual use of zoning, all kinds of tools that would help local communities plan to grow, right, and plan to where housing development and other development makes sense as well too. So the zoning tools have a lot of data and information. Happy to share more details with folks offline about what we can share now, and then stay tuned on the full release of the zoning atlas, where the maps will, where everybody will be able to go in and tinker and play with those on their own as well too.
Okay. Thank you. Our next question is from an anonymous attendee who says that they are a 2L law student, a Black single mother of 2. Her kids she and her kids have been homeless for the past 10 months, so they are very familiar with how bad the housing situation is in Rhode Island, especially if you want to live in Bristol County. Her question is, when I graduate, how can I use my degree to help fix the housing situation?
So as I said, most of what gets built and where it gets built is controlled at the local level. So I turn the question back to everybody on this call. Who knows who's on their local zoning board or planning board in their community? Do they know you? Do they know of your interest and concern in housing? Once you graduate with a law degree, you would be more than welcome, and you would be more than welcome now to serve on the boards or committees of local community development corporations or on boards and committees at local city levels. So use your skills and use your knowledge and use your personal story to help advocate for more housing development at the local level. And so I wish you well, and I know how challenging law school is to do even without homeless housing and homeless issues to face as well too. And so sending you good vibes and good wishes to address those issues. But I started in this business years ago, shortly after I graduated from law school, just starting with a neighborhood group and getting involved in local issues. And ultimately that put me on a career path now in housing and community development and space that I'm still on today, obviously. But so just dive in and start to share your story.
Thank you both. The next question is from Brett Pelletier. It says, thank you so much for this presentation. Great work. How important is it to educate people who are not directly connected to the affordable housing business, but have impact on the development of housing? What is being done to enhance the education of members of the community, board and commission members, and others? And how can we influence that conversation?
Mm-hmm. No, great question. I already mentioned a little bit about how housing works locally, trainings that we're doing, targeting individuals and communities, largely working with the HEZ communities, the health equity zones, and local communities to train people up about the local process. We are working with other colleagues. Actually, I see a colleague on the is one of the attendees to hopefully work with the state to develop a statewide housing plan that would also kind of work to decide where growth makes sense and where we can encourage growth and development as well too. And so there's a lot of work and opportunity that we need to do to continue to educate folks. And let me just do is a little, and I can't see the chat, so I'll have to rely on you, Elaine, to do it. But what words come to your head, or what words come to your mind when I say home and housing? What are some descriptive words that come into your head?
Folks can pop those into the Q&A.
Oh, Q&A. Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Somebody said warm and safe, a building. And anyone else want to add? Okay, so what happens now if I say, and what comes to your head when I say affordable homes or affordable housing or low income housing? Throw out some descriptive words then. Small, I see. Anyone else have one? But I think you can somewhat see my point, or start to see my point. Once we add that descriptive word, right, to affordable and low income, oftentimes, particularly at the local level, the conversation shifts. Much more negativity comes up as part of that. Small Section 8 vouchers, more kids in the school. All of these arguments start to come up, or negativity, and that comes up with them. And it's largely because of the myths around housing and housing development as well too, but those are alive and well. And so trying to work with individuals and communities to dispel those myths and to address those concerns so that we can encourage growth and development where it makes sense, so that we make sure that the path. I believe as a housing advocate that the path to economic opportunity begins at your front door. And I think we all agree that nothing works well in your life if you don't have that safe and decent place to get up from every day and to go back to every night. And I'll stop there in case we got more. I see I saw an other, I don't know if we have
Actually, I have a question for you.
yeah, go
Brenda.
ahead.
So, I'm a historian of housing and myself, and I'm wondering, so there are obviously there's been arguments about housing and what is proper housing and how do we make affordable housing for years and years and years. But you've been at this for a long time. So it's a two-part question. What have you found is the most effective argument, I guess, in terms of advocating for housing among skeptical affordable housing, or sort of using those tools in the toolbox, right, that you presented for communities that might be skeptical of this, and what is Burrillville doing that other people are not doing? How is Burrillville?
Yeah,
pocket of affordability, I guess.
Yeah, it's real. First of all, Burrillville had strong leadership, and so they had a great community planner who is now the planner in Warwick and doing his magic there, which I'm really happy about. And they also had local officials who realized that they had underutilized land and space that was reducing their property tax base, right? And they had vacant and abandoned mills. They're also, if you're familiar with that part of the state, their major employer is Eleanor Slater Hospital, which has a lot of low-wage workers and a lot of individuals who needed more affordable homes. They also are kind of in the small corner of Rhode Island that's in the snow belt, so they get more than their fair share of snow, and wanted people to be able to work and travel to work in a more shorter distance and shorter time as well too. So it was a combination of different things, but a lot of it was local political will that got people understanding it. I think we're seeing more and more of that as again, this housing crisis and affordability has been a major problem for a long period of time, since even before HousingWorks was formed in 2004 for low wage workers. But every time it starts to creep up into more of the middle income, that missing middle housing, when we have vacancy rates, at 2 or 3%, and that even somebody, or I just spoke at Wheeler School a couple of weeks ago, and their faculty there were commenting about how people that they're trying to hire for jobs have not come because they can't afford housing. And, those are pretty decent jobs, right? And pretty high, decent level paying jobs. And so when it creeps into that level, when it starts to affect workforce retention at more middle income housing, that's when we start to see a whole lot more political will around this. And that's exactly what's happening now, as we know as well too. It's still, we've got federal money, we've got more state interest and political will at this point in time, but still continuing to break down those barriers at the local level as to what needs to happen. We've had a law in the books, as I said, for a long period of time, the Low to Moderate Income Housing Act, that it requires every community to work towards their goal of 10%, but we have done little to enforce it, B, to give resources to communities to develop their plans, to identify areas of growth that make sense. And so hopeful that as we continue to work on these issues with the legislature this year, that we will do a better job of supporting those local communities.
Thank you. We have another question from Alan Hans. He says, thanks, Brenda. Could you talk about the housing first approach to dealing with homelessness, unhoused populations, the challenges and virtues of that approach generally and in Rhode Island?
Thanks, Alan, for that. I appreciate the question. And so the Housing First, as some of you know, is kind of a bigger overall term for permanent supportive housing. Met a lot of publicity, a lot of news stories around homelessness numbers in Rhode Island, and the challenges that we continue to face to address emergency needs and immediate needs of housing for individuals as well. And so permanent supportive housing and the Housing First model try to combine the segment of housing, some people are homeless because of economic conditions and economic issues, but some folks who what we deem chronically homeless, and they're a subset of the overall homeless numbers, also need services in order to be able to stay housed or to get housed and to stay housed. And the Housing First model provides the housing first and makes then wraps around those services, whether they're mental health services, whether they're drug treatment, whatever it is that is causing that homelessness, causing that individual to be homeless, trying to address those underlying issues to improve outcomes for that individual and their family. And so again, a lot of need, a lot of interest. Our goal is to move from a shelter-based system in the state to a housing-based system. And in order to do that, permanent supportive housing and Housing First is a critical model to do that. Again, in partnership with the Rhode Island Department of Health, we're doing a series of trainings with local groups around permanent supportive housing. Happy to share the registration links with anyone who wants to sit in on a 3-part series that we're doing on Zoom, understanding the history of homelessness and housing challenges nationwide and in Rhode Island, and then diving in a little deeper on the Housing First model and permanent supportive housing.
Thank you. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. It says, one of the things that is really challenging, I think, is that affordable housing is often relatively unsafe. Rather than getting a more inclusive zoning passed, we sort of settle for folks living in under-regulated, unsafe housing. What are the best paths, legislative or otherwise, to improving the quality of Rhode Island housing stock? And what types of regulation need to be in place to prevent that from going hand in hand with an increase in rents?
Mm-hmm. No, you raise important points. And like I said, Rhode Island really has 2 problems, right? Affordability and quality. And so we have laws on the book, code enforcement, that are rarely and unevenly enforced. And we also don't have significant resources to do home repair and maintenance for property owners as well, too. So looking at ways to put more teeth, if you will, into code enforcement, but also realizing that we've got a very challenging housing stock and quality of that housing stock is challenging, and looking to target some resources to improve that. Again, with Department of Health and others, not only making improving the physical condition of it, but also it improves the quality of the house and the health of that house as well. I mentioned earlier in the session about, and I'm not sure if anyone responded, but anyone want to guess what one of the biggest causes of absenteeism is in Providence school system? Not sure if I see any responses yet, but I'll give you the answer. It's asthma. And asthma is directly related to housing quality and condition, but also to neighborhood quality and condition and air quality. One of the biggest and highest rates in the state, it is the highest rate in the state of pediatric asthma, is in the 02907 zip code in Providence. And so working to try to improve the health and quality of the housing stock is through code enforcement, but also through additional resources to improve it, and require some rent stabilization as part of that that funding and money for a property owner as well too. To address your other concern, there's several pieces of legislation at the State House trying to do exactly that. So stay tuned on that front as well too. It's also important to because not only is our housing stock old, we also have an aging population, and a lot of that population wants to age in place or age in community. And the challenge of doing that in this housing stock is wide. And so as we try to address our population needs for our seniors as well too, we need to do even more and provide more incentives to property owners to fix their property moving forward.
Thanks, Brenda. We also have a question from Marcus Hanscom. It says, Brenda, what is your sense from the housing community on how meaningful and helpful the new down payment assistance grant for first-time home buyers will be? Given how expensive housing remains, is there a feeling that while it's a nice program, it may not be enough for the average first-time buyer?
Mark is spot on. You're absolutely right. It's not, and you know, it's not enough. It doesn't provide enough targeting of the program. It's not enough overall for it to address kind of the disparities around homeownership. We do nothing to target homeownership rates in neighborhoods that are well underneath the homeownership rate. The program doesn't do anything to target the disparity in the homeownership rates that I mentioned earlier on between white homeowners and Black and Hispanic homeowners in the state. So as we move forward, and as we in the state budget, a number of folks are advocating for a more equitable budget. And one of the things that we propose as part of that, in partnership with our colleagues at Economic Progress Institute, is more targeting of resources to address that homeownership disparity, and target neighborhoods and communities that have lower homeownership rates, and to target populations that have significantly lower homeownership rates.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Katie Gradowski. It says, how can landlords be proactively involved in this conversation beyond simply not blocking zoning, not opposing tenant-friendly legislation?
So, I mean, and we talk to a lot of landlord groups as well, too. And I think, you know, landlords, particularly during COVID, had many of the same challenges that their tenants had. They lost jobs, they lost income, you know, they were sick. And so Rhode Island does not, unlike in other states, does not have a lot of corporate ownership of multifamily properties. A lot of the units are still often locally owned or controlled by an individual as well, too. And so many of these, so we have a lot of smaller property owners, right? And smaller landlords as well, too, who suffer from the same thing. So I think they need to also advocate for more resources, more ways to keep that local control and local community control for local landlords, so we can, so that more people can get into the multifamily business and homeownership business. So you know, I think that's always the tension is, you know, how do we prevent this from being an us and them? That if I only win if you lose something. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is something and improving a stock and a housing stock that we can all get value out of and that we can all benefit from. So I think there's, you know, coming to the table and advocating for their own interests for sure, but also coming with open ears to listen to the concerns of others as well. I will tell you, I want a nice anecdote, and I'm not sure if anyone, I think Susie's on from the law school, and we work closely with the Pro Bono Collaborative and other Rhode Island Legal Services on the eviction defense work. And Susie and her colleague Eliza have done a huge amount of work at the eviction help desk at eviction court. But one of my favorite stories, Susie, was a while back when, because of COVID, the help desk got shut down. And the private, the landlords' lawyers, when they returned, came back to them and said, "Where have you been? We missed you," you know. And so it's, again, thinking about it as an us and them doesn't get us anywhere, and thinking about how we can work collectively together to address everybody's needs is what we need to be doing more of.
Thank you. And you have some seconding of that, of that view in our Q&A as well. Well, we're just about at 8 o'clock, which is at the end of our hour. So we might have time for one more question if someone wants to sneak one in.
I just want to do a shout out while we're doing that too, to a longtime colleague and a member of HousingWorks Advisory Board, Nancy Greer. Nancy, thanks so much for joining. Nancy served as the state director for our local HUD office for many, many years. So glad to see her with us today.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, Brenda, for sharing your work and your expertise with us, and the realities of our housing landscape here in Rhode Island. Really important for all of us to be aware of the work that you do and these realities. So thank you to our audience as well. I see folks saying thank you in the Q&A as well as we go out.
Yeah, and I just encourage us all to think about, you know, I mean, think about where you grew up and what value where you grew up gave you or didn't, or what things you had that you didn't have that others don't. And so zip code does matter.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night.
You joining us.
Thank you.